Welcome to the What, Why, and How Can I podcast, and today we will be talking about your career. All I know about you is that you're a physician. I don't know exactly what you do or who you work with. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
So I'll tell you about a little bit about what I do. I am a chronic pain management physician, which is a subspecialty of anesthesiology. So to get to where I am, I had to become an anesthesiologist first.
Okay.
And I was trained in putting people to sleep for surgery and doing other procedures to make their pain go away.
Okay.
And having had that foundation, I then underwent additional training in pain management, which is an entirely different kind of practice, because anesthesiology is primarily operating room based. So I spent 99% of my time in an operating room, versus what I do now. It's almost exclusively clinic based. So I'm in an office setting all day, and I see patients in an office setting who present or show up with complaints of pain anywhere from the top of their head to their toes. And since I'm trained in many injection techniques, a lot of what I do outside of the office is procedures. And they can range from small little injections right in the office to very complex procedures that resemble injections, but they're actually minimally invasive surgeries. So what I do is I identify the source of pain, ask myself a question: can it be dealt with medications? If not, can it be dealt with physical therapy or some sort of rehabilitation? If not that, then I'll do procedures like my injections or other types of procedures where I can either deliver medicine to calm the inflammation, or I can kill the nerves using electrical current, or I can put cement in broken parts of bone and cement them and stabilize them.
Sure.
If none of these procedures help, then they get a referral to either an orthopedic or a spine surgeon, and that problem's dealt with surgically, which of course has a much greater recovery and loss from work, etc.
Okay.
But that gives you a pretty good scope of what I do. It's hard to pin one disease state because there are so many. But top three diagnoses that I see are chronic low back pain, number one. Number two is chronic headache / migraine, and number three is chronic neck pain. And then everything else that follows.
Okay. So do you do the injections yourself, or are you more of the guy that analyzes the patient and then kind of writes, okay, this is what this patient needs, and then somebody else kind of does the work for you?
No, I do all the work myself.
Okay, so you analyze the patient and you provide the drugs.
So I treat the patient from beginning to end.
Okay.
And if I refer the patient, what that means is that I don't do the actual treatment, somebody else does.
Okay.
But I only refer patients out for surgery.
Okay. Okay, gotcha.
So unless it requires extensive surgery, and some of the small surgeries I can do myself, then I'll refer the patient out to a surgeon for, say, shoulder surgery. If it requires repair, cutting open of the skin, reattachment of muscles, realignment or fixing of bones, then that's an entirely different surgical specialty. Okay. Which I'm not in. My specialty is a hybrid specialty. So I do everything up until somebody needs to get cut. And that typically involves all sorts of minimally invasive procedures, which include needles, ports, injections of sorts, yeah.
Okay. So I don't want this to become a political question per se, and not you specifically, but are physicians like you... some people would like to blame physicians like you for, like, say, the opiate crisis or the drug addiction crisis in the United States today. Do you know a little bit about that fact and how what part physicians played in people actually being addicted to drugs or drugs that help people? What's your take on it?
So I actually know a lot about the topic. Number one, it is within the realm of my specialty
Mm-hmm.
because I prescribe opioids on a daily basis.
Okay.
Number two, I lecture on the topic throughout the state, multiple agencies.
Mm-hmm.
And I also run a 12-step addiction program at a local church that also includes people addicted to opioids and other drug classes.
Mm-hmm.
Opioids aren't the only addicting medications, number one. There are many other addicting medications that we rarely hear about, especially on the media.
Mm-hmm.
Those medications belong to a class of drugs collectively known as benzodiazepines.
Mm-hmm.
So what that means is there's a molecule that has a certain structure, and all drugs that belong to it are called that. So if you heard of brand names like Xanax,
Right.
Klonopin, those are all anxiety medications. And these are highly addicting medications, and withdrawal from these medications can be fatal or lethal.
Mm-hmm.
And withdrawal from opioids actually is not lethal. You can withdraw from opioids and nothing will happen. You'll be sick. Patient will experience flu-like symptoms for a couple of days, but they will not die.
Okay.
Unlike for the medications that treat anxiety, those are highly addicting, and withdrawal from them can cause a seizure, and the seizure can be fatal.
Okay. Wow.
There's also a class of drugs called hypnotics.
Mm-hmm.
That comes from a Greek word hypnos, which means sleep. Those are sleep aids. So a lot of people don't get regular sleep, have a poor sleep hygiene, and then they begin to rely on medications like Ambien that we heard about more recently in the media of certain celebrities acting strangely while on these medications and blaming their erratic behavior for the medication. So these medications are also addicting in the sense that one begins to rely on sleep for them because they can't sleep without them, and that rewires their architecture in the brain. They become dependent on them. So addiction and dependence are somewhat misused. They're different things. But it's outside the scope of this conversation. But going back to the opioids, so the problem with opioids has been is that we've had opioids for a long time. They're not new. Opioids have been used for thousands of years. They've been even mentioned in Odyssey, written by Homer, and they've been used throughout Asia. They've been used throughout the Middle East. And we've had addictions going back to the Civil War when we had over 100,000 soldiers addicted to morphine right after the Civil War because there's so many wounded after this event. Okay. And shortly after Civil War, we had two things needed for addiction. We had a needle, which was discovered about 40 years before the war, and we had isolation of morphine. So morphine was isolated in 1800s from opium. Before that, everybody smoked opium, and that's how addiction persisted throughout centuries and millennia. But we've had first opioid epidemic in the United States after the Civil War, and so there were different eras and periods where we had opioid epidemic, and we had one in San Francisco, where Chinese laborers under harsh conditions smoked opium. And in fact, the U.S. government thought that heroin would be the answer to this epidemic, and they synthesized heroin thinking that this would be a good treatment for morphine addiction. And we found out later that the opposite was true. So we've had opioids for a long time. They're not new drugs. They're not going to go away. They're used for treatment of severe, chronic, around-the-clock pain because other agents simply don't work. And what are other agents? One could go, look at the counter at Walgreens and, for example, see, anti-inflammatories like ibuprofen. You can see Tylenol. But beyond that, there's very little that one could get without prescription. Okay. And then so then someone comes to a doctor, could be a primary care doctor like family medicine or somebody like me, and they get medications from different classes. They're nerve medications. They're medications that are in the class of antidepressants. And they work differently. They work on, different areas of the brain to kind of dull down the transmission of pain. But ultimately, nothing works as good as an opioid. An opioid makes modern surgery possible. People have very traumatic surgeries. People have their chest split open to have their heart fixed. People have heart transplants. People have knee replacements. People can undergo massive spine surgeries, which weren't possible before, and they recover just fine, all thanks to the opioids. The problem with opioids is that they're addicting in the sense that they relieve pain and also elevate someone's mood. And so the word opioid epidemic didn't come on the media until probably about 2013 through 2016, and then it really gained momentum 2016 going forward. But what happened before that is there was a one company in particular called Purdue Pharma. Purdue Pharma took a drug that was synthesized and made in Nazi Germany called oxycodone, and they made a delayed release or extended release formulation of the drug, and then they packaged it and marketed this drug very aggressively. And they used a paper from 1980, which was a fraudulent paper, and it wasn't a large study. It was basically an opinion piece. And they went to doctors' offices with this information, and those were typically young female drug representatives from the company. Yeah. And they spread this lie that if you put an oxycodone molecule into an extended release formulation, then it is not addicting. And then they lobbied very aggressively to make pain the fifth vital sign. So vital signs are blood pressure, pulse, respiratory rate, etc. They wanted to make pain a fifth vital sign. And so they lobbied for that very aggressively. And what that would mean is that you, as a physician, were obligated to treat pain if a patient has one. And if you didn't, you could be liable, and your medical license would be at risk. So there's many different facets to this story. If there's a company to blame, everybody loves to blame Purdue Pharma, but ultimately the people that are responsible for opioid epidemic are physicians, without a question. So who has the power to write a prescription for these medications? Physicians do. Right. Who has the license to write for these prescriptions? Physicians do. They have a special license called DEA certificate. It's issued by the Drug Enforcement Agency. And every physician that writes for these medications must have one, including myself, and I've had several. And so for a physician to write these medications, we have to make an assessment. Is this pain so resistant to treatment that opioids are justified? The problem we have in the United States, we have an aging population. We have problems with insurance coverage and massive costs. And so opioids were a cheap alternative to complicated degenerative conditions that cause pain. And so doctors started seeing that as a solution to the growing chronic pain problem, and prescribing them more and more liberally. So, and surgeons in particular, when they would do surgery, they were very liberal with writing large prescriptions or large quantities of these medications. And if someone took this medication on a regular basis for 30 days, their chance of addiction would be close to 50%. Wow. So someone went home after surgery with a bottle of these medications, and they took them exactly like the bottle said, which a lot of patients would assume that that's what they're supposed to do. Then they would probably become addicted to these pills if they're on it for a month. So we realized that as a medical community, and this in part was from education by physicians within my specialty and others, and guidelines came out limiting the quantity of these medications prescribed and the conditions for which they could be prescribed. So the opioid epidemic was caused by physicians without a doubt. It was perpetuated by greed by a company called Purdue Pharma, and they made $34 billion on a drug that was not new. Wow. A drug that was as old as we can remember, dating back to the World War II. And this drug in particular was incredibly addicting for many different reasons. And it was addicting because it was, number one, an oral medication, a pill. And number two, as a molecule, it's a very addicting molecule more addicting than most opioids, like oral morphine or oral hydrocodone or codeine,
Really?
etc.
I mean, what's crazy to me is I'm 27, but about 10 years ago, I was 17, 18, 19, and the community that I grew up with, a lot of the people that I grew up with became addicted on this specific drug, OxyContin. And a lot of the young guys to this day I know are still kind of are bearing the unfortunate the bad results of Purdue Pharma and what you were saying, the physicians that prescribed it. And I know most of them didn't get it from physicians, they bought it from other people. But is it that easy for physicians to prescribe, or were physicians given a bonus based on how many pills they sold or drugs? How does that system work?
So it's illegal to receive payments directly from manufacturer or supplier of any type of medication. But it was there were bad actors within medical community, and there were people, especially specifically physicians, that used their medical license as an excuse to become a neighborhood drug dealer.
Okay.
And so they would recklessly write these medications without medication, without appropriate physical exam, without appropriate workup. And they would write them in large quantities, knowing that people that would receive these prescriptions were not legitimate paying patients.
Okay.
That they would engage in something we call diversion of these medications, that they would sell them for profit on the street, and the profits were pretty obscene, because if someone had insurance that covered the cost of the prescription, which was actually quite expensive, a monthly supply of OxyContin branded was $1,200.
Wow.
So if somebody received, for example, 3 pills a day, 90 tablets of OxyContin 80, they could then go on the street and sell each pill for $80.
Okay.
So they would make basically a monthly salary on selling this medication, not doing any work, simply by diverting or these medications from proper use to abuse.
Right.
So one went from proper use to abuse, and that's how the in part opiate epidemic started. Now, when restrictions came into place, and oxycodone as a molecule was recognized to be an issue, and we've known it to be an issue, then these restrictions created a different problem. It drove a lot of people from oxycodone who were patients after they've been cut off by their physicians into illicit sources, which is typically now heroin. So when they went to heroin, the problem became is that there wasn't enough heroin to go around, and there was an intense competition going on among dealers as to who had the best heroin. So they began to adulterate heroin with a different drug called fentanyl. Fentanyl is a powder. It's made in China, but we use that in surgery as a liquid for injection. And so the problem with fentanyl is dosing. Fentanyl is an incredibly potent drug. It's 100 times more powerful than morphine. And when something is that powerful, you use a much smaller dose. So fentanyl is dosed in micrograms,
Okay.
not milligrams, micrograms. That is 1,000 times less than a milligram.
Wow.
So, and that in turn is 1,000 times less than a gram. And so heroin is sold in grams. Okay. And so a drug dealer, which would get a illicit or illegal fentanyl powder, say from China or from south of the border, would mix microgram quantities of fentanyl with gram quantities of heroin, not understanding the pharmacology or even basic math, would create fatal concoctions of heroin fentanyl mix and kill the users. And so what we saw in 2017, 2018 was a massive 300, 500 fold, 300, 500% increase in fentanyl deaths. So if we had an epidemic, that was the illicit fentanyl, and that primarily targeted the heroin users which we've built up over many years, and in part, some of the physicians were to blame.
Okay. That's very, very interesting, and I hopefully after this we can maybe dedicate a podcast, if you have time, specifically to addiction and how that works. I'd like to go back a little bit back to your physician as a career, and if you can just talk about a little bit about your just your daily schedule. Someone maybe that's looking into a career like yours. What's a daily schedule like? How many patients do you meet throughout the day? Something like that.
So my specialty specifically may be an outlier as to how much or how little I work. But typically physicians work anywhere from 50 to 60 hours a week. I work about 45. On occasion, I'll work maybe 48. Rarely, I'll work more than 50 hours. There was a time where I worked about 50, 60 hours a week, but
Wow.
that was in the past. I didn't want to do that anymore, and it was entirely up to me. It wasn't something I had to do. It was entirely my choice.
Okay.
So right now I have office-based practice. It's primarily 8 to 5 with an hour lunch. I typically run over and I rarely take lunch, or I eat the food, but I don't take the hour lunch.
Right.
My employees do, but I don't.
Okay.
And I work about 45, 46 hours a week. And for the most part, since I am in an office setting, I don't have to take call. Now, call means that a physician goes to the hospital to cover in case an emergency arises. And these doctors typically have to either sleep in a hospital or live very close by. And they have, to this day, they have pagers, and now they increasingly use cell phones to be available and to come to the hospital immediately if there's a need that comes up. So as far as my job, intensity or workload is something I'm in complete control of, because I can regulate how many patients I see in a day, and I basically go on based on what the need is. What I do is I start at 8 in the morning, I go at 5, and I see typically on average about 35 patients a day.
Okay.
Sometimes it's 30 patients, sometimes it's 40, but typically my target is 35 patients a day, and I got to this point because of a learned efficiency.
Okay.
So when I started out in practice, my first year, 20 patients for me seemed somewhat overwhelming. Then 25 was sort of doable, and I felt like I was getting better at it. But over time, especially 3 to 5 years into practice, there are certain patterns that we immediately recognize. So you don't have to spend as much time interviewing the patient, and you develop certain tools and tricks to get more information quicker, like forms that patients fill out. I don't have to ask as many questions. I can get a lot of that information from a form that someone filled out before they came into the office.
Okay.
And I also review the records that they came with very quickly, so I get a lot of information, so I can go straight to the physical exam, make a diagnosis, ordering appropriate studies, and moving forward. But as far as my workload, it's very reasonable. I'm very happy. I do get tired. The procedure days can be long and difficult. They can be 9-10 hours a day where I stand and wear protective equipment like a lead shield, goggles, etc.
Wow.
But at the end of the day, it's an incredibly satisfying career, and I just couldn't imagine. I couldn't even imagine 10 years ago how great my life would be today, like it is, because my work really gives me satisfaction and joy. I really enjoy doing what I do. I enjoy interacting with people, making a difference in their life. And I meet the people from different fields, and I also learn something new from them. So I teach them about their condition, and in return, they come from many different specialties. I treat the old, the young, the rich and poor, male, female, and I get to learn about people's problems. Not just about their problems, I learn about their interests. I learn about their careers. I learn a lot about the world. Because we can't know everything, and you learn by interacting with people.
Right.
So from that perspective, I think my job is incredibly satisfying. I'm very happy and grateful that God led me down this path. And overall, my job satisfaction is probably a 10 out of 10.
Honestly, that's amazing. A lot of nurses I spoke to, either or physicians. I haven't spoken to many physicians, but nurses, people in the medical field, they either love their job or they hate their job. Why did you choose to steer towards this career or this path? Was it something that you knew initially you wanted to work with these types of patients, or is like just through your experience is this what you were led to?
So there's a great deal of control for any particular employee. We're not servants. We can change jobs.
Okay.
And so the reason there's a great degree of job dissatisfaction is, in my view, it has to do with a choice. So I had a choice to be in an operating room. I had a choice to be an employee of a hospital or be in a partnership or be in a hospital all the time. I knew the potential that I would have to take call, and I knew that, up front, I would probably be better off financially, but I chose not to take that path. I figured if I was persistent in the beginning, and if I delayed gratification, financial one initially, that I could catch up later on and in a process save my sanity. So I chose to go into clinical private practice. So I am in private practice, and what the advantage of that is that I work for a group of like-minded physicians, and we bill the patients directly. The finances come to us. We choose over which employees we hire. We bonus them if they perform. We get rid of them if they don't perform. And we create an environment for ourselves and patients where there's accountability and there's control. If there's something we don't like, we change. The problem with job dissatisfaction is when someone else is in control of your job, and that typically is administrators who are not in a medical field, and they enforce all sorts of bureaucratic, useless rules, and these bureaucratic, useless rules is what wears people out. If you ask a nurse, if you ask a physician, what is it that they hate most about their job? It's administrative tasks. It's not patient care. It's almost never patient care. It's administrative tasks that drive job dissatisfaction.
That's true.
So when we built this practice that I'm a part of, I've used technology to my advantage, specifically electronic medical records, which can be a great burden for a lot of physicians. But through creation of templates and pre-populated different smart phrases, I spend very little time charting. I can see 35 patients in a day. I do not use a dictation system where somebody else transcribes what I say into a little speakerphone or a little recorder. I use a computer, and by clicking smart phrases, I can populate a full patient encounter in less than 3 minutes, and the patient can leave my office visit with the entire note and treatment plan in their hand.
Wow.
Which is very different from a hospital where people are bogged down with crazy charting systems, electronic medical records that are built not by physicians, they're built by administrators, and the motive behind these systems and the objective of these systems is to collect revenue. So those are all revenue driven. So healthcare in the US has become very problematic because of growth of administrators and useless rules. And that is what drives the greatest degree of physician dissatisfaction. It's well publicized. There's literature all over the place, and it's administrative workload and burden. I would say that the administrative burden is what drives nursing and physician dissatisfaction. So if a nurse is burned out, she can find a different job. She can move to a different location. But to continue on and complain, that's not a solution to a problem.
Okay.
I've started 3 startups, and 2 of them crashed and burned, and financially I suffered. But in the end, money's money, but I want to be happy. And so I'm happy when I'm in control, when I'm happy, when my patients are happy. And the way that to create that environment is to provide what's best for the patient, not what's best for my hospital administrator or what's best for the CEO's bonus at the end of the year.
Correct. That makes sense.
So I think the problem with today's healthcare is not physicians, it's not nurses, it's administrators who try very hard to make themselves important, but they actually are a reason for this burnout among physicians and nurses and a great degree of job dissatisfaction.
I mean, I had somebody that works in the office side of the hospital system in administration, and I think she said that 40% of like, for example, Sutter or Kaiser, 40% of the entire staff is all administration with like separate huge offices, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And that's really starting to make sense because they're trying to implement things that think they make sense to them when the patient and physician relationship is different than, like you were saying, charting, and nurses always complain about charting. I have never have time because I have to chart. So why did you choose? So that was a little bit about why you chose to kind of join a practice where you practice for yourself. Why become a physician out of all the different medical professions there are?
So to make a difference in someone's life, you can be in an administrative role to help them, deal with the finances. You can be in a supportive role,
right?
But you can be in a decision-making role. So I wanted to be in a position where I was the decision maker,
okay,
not executing orders of someone else, which I may disagree with or I may have different ideas about. So I think it has to do with the personality. Some people are type A personality, some people are AAA personality, some people are type B personality. It all depends on what gives someone satisfaction in their job.
Okay.
For some people, it's very stressful to make difficult decisions. And frankly, they don't want to deal with those types of decisions. They don't want to be the decision makers that can have a negative outcomes. It's easy to take credit for when something goes well, but when something goes catastrophically wrong, it's a very different and difficult place to be in.
Right. So,
since high school, I knew that I did not want to be in a support role. I wanted to be the decision maker. I wanted to be at the top of the decision-making chain, and I didn't care how long it was going to take me. So I did whatever was necessary to get to where I am, and what it took was an incredible amount of very hard work. Took an incredible amount of persistence. There were a lot of distractions along the way. When I started college in '97, computers became very hot in '99, and people were dropping out left and right to take programming courses, and were getting paid a lot of money right out of 2-year college degree, and continued on to be very successful. And so if money was a motivator, it misled or detracted a lot of people from their objectives in life. But that wasn't me. I was focused, and I did eventually become distracted because there was another industry that I became interested in, which was biotech. There was an explosion of biotech in the early 2000s, and I wanted to get a master's degree in molecular biology and physiology and biophysics, which I did. But I wasted 2 years of my life on that because I, to this day, don't use any of this knowledge that I acquired and spent a lot of time obtaining. But that still would have been a satisfying career because I would have been in a setting where I affect people's lives on a more global or a much larger scale, discovering drugs, discovering new medications, discovering new treatments. But again, I didn't want to be in a position where I was told what to do, where I was going to have a routine 9 to 5. I wanted to have creativity. I wanted to have input. And I wanted my thoughts and ideas to be implemented in whatever I saw or dealt with. And so I realized that the only way to do that, the only way to have this satisfaction, is to go straight to the top. Now, it's much easier said than done. People that get to the top face enormous competition,
Right.
and that's where persistence and a lot of hard work becomes important.
So
And intelligence itself is not necessarily a determinant of success. While it is important, I think it's persistence and just hard work that propels someone to success in life. And so the problem with a lot of young people nowadays is impatience. So when I look at my kids, they want everything now. They want everything within a few minutes. It's a very rare or foreign concept for someone to look at things in decades. So if you look at your life, it's like, what is my life going to look like? If I just get this short little career completed that takes me a year or two to complete, well, I still have to deal with that for another 50, 60 years. So if you look at things long term, if you look at a 50-year career, 50-year career, so you can spend 2 years on an educational objective where you are in the bottom of the support role and take orders from someone to the rest of your life. Then as you evolve as a person, you might resent your job and resent people around you, but that is your capability. That's what you're capable of doing. You can't do anymore because of your training. Versus spending a decade, for example, early on, getting all the way to the top, and then having so many different options and directions that you could take in life. To me, that was incredibly satisfying and liberating. I could do many things right now. I'm not just a physician. I also do a lot of clinical research. I take on different projects. I do a lot of consulting. I deal with pharmaceutical companies. I deal with equipment manufacturers. I travel. I go to conferences. So my life is incredibly fulfilling and meaningful, and I have a lot of freedom in what I do.
That's awesome.
But the sacrifices were enormous. I basically gave up a decade of my life where everybody, went out, had a good time, ate, drove around in nice cars. I was focused. I didn't enjoy any of these things when they did, but I do now to a much greater degree.
Yeah.
So, but also what gives me joy in life right now are not things. I have very little appreciation for material things. What gives me the greatest joy in life is relationships with people that I would never have met had I not been a physician. I meet incredible people. I share incredible experiences with them because I'm a physician, and that would not be possible if I was in a support role. And I meet people from different, careers. For example, I treat a lot of police officers and firefighters, and I treat the rich and the poor. I treat people who are, basically on no income to billionaires.
Yeah.
And so I went flying on helicopters with police. I learned all about flying. I went flying with on a plane and learned how to fly a little bit. And I've done a multitude of experiences because of my exposure to people that I deal with on a daily basis. I could even imagine a life like that. I couldn't even imagine of having this kind of exposure, because most people belong to country clubs where they interact with people like that and they pay a lot of money for them.
Yes.
But here I am living the good life, not only helping them, but their gratitude in return is very rewarding for me. So I think this is the absolute best thing that could happen to me. I think this is an incredible blessing for me in life, but it did require a lot of hard work and persistence. And so if I was going to hammer a point home for everybody making a career choice, is you have to sit down and basically draw a timeline of your life. Okay, start with time 0 and end with 75, 80. Most people work till 70. This is a very long time to be working. And retirement age will change eventually to 70. It's 66 right now and change, but people don't realize that they will spend a long time working. The problem they also don't think about is that as they age, their ability to work will decrease. So they will have degenerative disease of their spine, they will have illnesses that will limit them from doing a lot in their work. And at the same time, if they are in low income brackets, they'll bring on additional stress of being unable to provide for their family. So it's not just finances that should make decisions, because one can make good amount of money up front when they're healthy, but they're not going to continue to make that money as they age. For example, one can go and climb poles and be an electrician and make 100,000 plus a year, but if they fall, they hurt themselves on the job, they won't be able to do that till they're 66.
Yeah.
So people don't realize that they're not going to stay the way they are. They're going to continue to change. Their bodies continue to change, and they need to be in a career that is not only satisfying mentally, financially, personally, but also doesn't strain their relationships in the family, doesn't strain relationships with their close ones. And gives them a lot of job satisfaction. So for me, that was medicine. For me, it was natural because when I was growing up, my mom used to take me to work. She was a nurse, and I had this exposure subconsciously early on, and I liked the environment, and I liked the white coat that she wore, and to me, it was almost a natural thing to do. But if someone wants to decide on a career in medicine, they should simply volunteer. It's very easy to get volunteering positions at different locations, and typically people go to hospitals thinking that's where I see real medicine. But yes, you can see real medicine in hospitals, but you also see a lot of unhappy people grumbling about administrative burdens, so they get discouraged from that. So I encourage people to go to private offices and see what physicians do, and maybe act as scribes or some kind of support role where they can learn and get a good view from as an outsider of what it is and what it means.
Okay, that's awesome. I was just going to ask you a couple minutes ago about how can I part of this podcast is how can somebody that's looking to be in the medical field, what can they expose themselves to? And you mentioned actually a very valuable point there, because when I hear people trying to become nurses, they're saying, oh, it's so difficult to become a volunteer at Kaiser. It's so difficult to become a volunteer at Sutter Hospital. But you just mentioned that there's private clinics, private practices that would, I don't know, do you guys need help or volunteers? How often does a volunteer come into your practice asking for a...
All the time.
Okay, awesome.
But the problem with a lot of volunteers is there's a lot of, I encounter a lot of entitlement. I encounter a lot of laziness.
Okay.
People come in and they want to volunteer for a day and get a letter of recommendation for volunteering for 8 hours. There's I meet people who aren't simply serious. And you can't teach that. Life and the difficulty of life and the threat of poverty will discipline these people at the right time. But it's not my job to do that. I know where I came from, and I knew what I wanted to get out of life, and the motto I've always lived by from since very young age, the motto I've always lived by is the following: nothing that is worthwhile is easy. Nothing that is worthwhile is easy. And if it's worthwhile, you better believe that it's difficult. And if it's worthwhile, you better believe that you will encounter fierce competition. But that should not be a detractor. That should not cause one to lose focus. That should only energize a person who wants to be where they see themselves in. And again, I tried very hard. I don't come from family of geniuses. I don't come from people who were, physicists or doctors. I come from a regular family. I'm a first doctor in the family. But it took for the most part persistence. It took very hard work, and I'll put that into perspective. I took ESL classes when I came to the United States at 14.
Mm-hmm.
My knowledge of the English language was minimal.
Mm-hmm.
I went to a Chicago public high school.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, my command of the English language was laughable. And then I took the most difficult test one can take, which is a medical college admission testing called MCAT, 8-hour test, majority of which tests one's ability to dissect information from very difficult passages.
Mm-hmm.
And so majority of people that do well, vast majority of people that do well on this section of the test are English majors.
Mm-hmm.
They come from families of professors or families of people who have an incredible command of the English language.
Mm-hmm.
And very, very few of these people, very few have any accents in English. And so here I am. Not only did I learn the language
Mm-hmm.
from scratch, right? I've mastered it,
Mm-hmm.
and it was only because of effort and work I put into it. So the barriers were all against me.
Mm-hmm.
There were incredible barriers,
Mm-hmm.
but I didn't look away and say, you know what, that's too difficult. I didn't blame my parents for bringing me to this country too late. I didn't blame anyone or anything.
Mm-hmm.
I saw an opportunity. And I told myself, I'm gonna do whatever I can, and however long it takes me, but I'm gonna do it.
Mm-hmm.
And I did. Persistence is key to success in any career. Whatever that career is, it's persistence. And again, nothing that is worthwhile is easy, ever. So to complain, to grumble, that's just something lazy people do. I have no sympathy for that ever.
Mm-hmm.
And they are masters of their success. If they want a average life, if they want a life of struggle, and that's their choice.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't see that in myself. I've persisted. I've grown both professionally, and in my professional growth, I've also found myself a niche where I can spiritually help a lot of people, and
Mm-hmm.
I see my ministry and my work, which is unique to my profession.
Mm-hmm.
I interact with 35 people on a daily basis. I can minister to them in ways that most people can't.
Mm-hmm.
I find them at the right moment, a desperate moment, and I can witness to them about the love of God,
Mm-hmm.
which a lot of people can't do. And so to me, that is also incredibly satisfying. I don't have to go on a mission to Haiti or Africa to minister. I minister right where I am every single day. And so to me, my life right now at this point as it is such a blessing that I couldn't even imagine it that way 10, 15 years ago, but it didn't seem that way.
Mm-hmm.
The process of getting to where I am was painful.
Mm-hmm.
It was brutal. It was disappointing. Sometimes I lost sight of where I was going,
Mm-hmm.
but I persisted. Despite the setbacks, but despite the difficulties, despite the struggles, I persisted.
So,
And in the end, I think this is a great blessing from God that I'm able to do what I love. And to me, job satisfaction to me is the single most important thing in my life right now when it comes to career and relationships and everything else, because that also allows me to go home and be with my kids and go out on weekends and do activities and not live in a hospital and serve other people.
Mm-hmm. So last question is, you talked about hard work, you talked about persistence, and a laziness. Some volunteers that come into the office are lazy. Talk to me about, were you always this disciplined, or did you have to learn discipline along the way, and how did you do that? Or what instilled?
Everything can be learned, but I think maybe to some degree I was driven internally.
Mm-hmm.
Since I was 14, I had a job. When I was 16, I had 3 jobs.
Mm-hmm.
When I was 18, I went to college full time. I went to the university full time, and I had 2 additional jobs.
Okay.
So this is something that was part of my life as I went through it. I like the intensity of everything. I never saw myself as a lazy person. I'm actually quite annoyed by laziness, and laziness leads to poverty. Lazy people make excuses.
Mm-hmm.
Lazy people blame others for their shortcomings. Laziness goes hand in hand with procrastination. I'm going to do that tomorrow. No, you're going to do that today. You're going to get on it today. You got to start now. Now is the time to start your dream. Now is the moment to pursue your dream. It's not tomorrow. It's not next year. It's right now, because time passes by, flies by you, right? And whatever you do with that time is your choice, your decision.
Amen.
So laziness is prevalent. It's widespread. And lazy people make excuses for their failures.
Amen.
And they blame somebody else, and they always blame somebody else.
Amen. I'm trying to remember, every time I felt lazy, I always had a reason of why I wasn't lazy, why I couldn't do something or the other thing. Andre, thank you so much for making the time to coming on the podcast.
You're welcome.
Yeah, really appreciate it. Super interesting to me personally. It was like listening to a sermon almost, you know, to lazy people. I hope some of them out there can definitely learn from this. I know I did.